Please welcome back to the stage our host for today, Kris Kirschner.
And welcome back to the second half of the Indiana Life Sciences Summit. It's so nice to have you here. At this time, we're going to turn our attention to another key component of our life sciences industry, our research universities. Dozens of startup companies are created and a tremendous amount of research is done each year at the IU School of Medicine, Purdue University, and the University of Notre Dame. But how has COVID-19 impacted their work? Well, to answer that question and more, we have Dr. Theresa Mayer, Vice President of Research for Purdue University, Dr. Hess, Dean of IU School of Medicine, and joining us remotely, Dr. Lynn Miranda, Provost of the University of Notre Dame. Welcome to you all. And we are pretty well socially distanced. I think if you feel comfortable, you may remove your mask. Might be easier to have a conversation. Thanks again for being here. A lot of work has been done. We talked a lot about COVID-19 and in each of your fronts. A lot in terms of research, in terms of products, in terms of just new things happening just over the course of the last few months. So I want to spend some time to talk a little bit about that from each of your perspectives. What has COVID-19 brought in that regard?
Well, in terms of our research, it's been an incredibly busy time. We're fighting the virus on several fronts. So one of them is we're building out a research infrastructure. So working together with Notre Dame and Purdue, the Clinical and Translational Sciences Institute has put together an information sharing site called WISE, which is Well-Being Informed by Scientific Evidence, and that provides the latest updates on research and clinical information. We are doing biospecimen banking. We have project development teams that help investigators develop new proposals. The Regenstrief Institute is providing a great deal of information through the Indiana Health Information Exchange. So that's infrastructure. We have people who are studying how the virus spreads. For example, Dr. Nir Menachemi with the Fairbanks School of Public Health made a very important study of patients who were randomly selected across the state, where we learned that the virus spreads asymptomatically. So over 40% of patients infected by this virus don't have symptoms. And of course, that had a lot of public health indications. And then finally, we're testing many different therapies in clinical trials like remdesivir, ruxolitinib, which is a JAK kinase inhibitor, convalescent plasma, and the trial that we really are eager to reopen is the AstraZeneca vaccine trial that's been halted in the U.S. until they can sort out the safety concerns.
Dr. Mayer?
Yeah, first I'd like to say it's really thank you for the invitation to join this virtual summit today. And it's been a very, very busy time, I think, for all of us at the research universities. First, I would like to acknowledge the really great interactions that we've had with the state and with our other research universities across the state, and working together. The governor, through his executive order, gave us a lot of flexibility to continue to conduct research and really, across the board, align our resources to help the nation and the world address this very significant challenge that we're experiencing. And that gave us the flexibility to keep many of our research labs open, even during the stay-at-home orders that we were all facing. And I can say that that wasn't the case across the country. Many of the research universities were pretty much shuttered. We've also been able to come back online very quickly. I think working together with IU and Notre Dame and our peers throughout the Midwest, we were able to align all of our strategies and processes, and that's made a big difference in our ability to really work together to address the challenges that we're facing. As Jay pointed out, we're really working across the spectrum. And I think what we've learned throughout the pandemic is that it's not simply an issue that our medical schools are addressing. We have research that's being conducted through very rapid funding mechanisms that are working in the area of therapeutics, vaccine development, but it goes well beyond that. We have teams that are working in community health, working to understand the impact of COVID on our educational response and on our children. We have researchers who are working to understand the impact of shuttering our facilities on the quality of our water and the quality of the environment. So I think as we look at this, we can be proud in the state of Indiana, and we can be proud at our research universities that we were really able to muster a lot of forces to come together to work with the nation and the world to really respond very quickly.
And Dr. Miranda, we'd like to hear from you.
Well, thank you, first of all, for including me on this panel. I feel at a little bit of a disadvantage because I think you can see me, but I can't see you. So, big hello to all of you there. Much of what I would say has been covered a little bit. There was that, as the pandemic first hit and really took hold in the United States, there was that pivot that occurred in March. We did hibernate a number of our research, our research units, but I think we've learned enough now. And if we had known then what we know now about the virus, and if we'd had, these protocols that were we established subsequently, immediately available to us, we wouldn't have shuttered. We didn't quite shutter. We wouldn't have slowed down our research. And as evidence of this, when we had our cool down period related to the surge of cases on campus, we actually didn't cool down our research operations at all. That was going forward full steam ahead. We have quite a bit of COVID-specific research going on, both just within Notre Dame, but I think really exciting. If we've got to find some silver linings about the pandemic, I think one of the silver linings is that there's been a lot of collaboration that's been going on across research universities. So both in terms of helping each other say, well, I've got a lab that's like this, and we're trying to figure out this problem. What are you doing? You must have a lab like that. So all this exchange of information on protocols, but also collaboration on actual research projects. So we have, we're doing work on wastewater, we're doing work on saliva-based sampling, we're doing work on the efficacy of different mask types as if you're going to wear this particular brand and type of mask, how effective is it versus these other ones, et cetera. A lot of virology research going on right now through these rapid mechanisms that NIH has stood up, as well as rapid mechanisms that the National Science Foundation has stood up. Joint with the 3 universities that are on this call right now, we've established a COVID-19 registry for the state of Indiana for us to understand how COVID-19 is spreading across time and space in our state, and provide that information in useful formats to local health departments and clinics and everybody in the healthcare sector, as well as everybody in the government sector, to help figure out how to make decisions about things. I will say, to add something that I'm sure my colleagues are thinking about, but we haven't touched on yet. When we think about the pandemic and research universities, I think there are a couple of groups of researchers that we really need to pay special attention to. So any researchers that need to spend a lot of time either overseas to do their work, or in direct engagement in the community doing their work, anybody who's a field scientist of any type. I ran a malaria intervention in East Africa for many years. That research has been much more complicated and has been slow slowed down substantially, and figuring out ways to support people. And this is, again, a place where this collaboration, where we're all being generous with each other and learning from each other, has been helpful. And the other thing I'll just put out there is that the pandemic has been especially hard on our researchers with families. And so many places, schools are online. So faculty are, dealing with the challenges of dual delivery in the classroom and kind of being a homeschooler at home, helping with the instruction of their kids, et cetera. So there are these impacts that all of us need to work very hard on addressing. And, frankly, the reality is that those particular set of impacts has been harder on our women researchers. But these are all things that, you can only deal with problems when you're aware that you have those issues. And I think that all three of our universities are very committed to figuring out creative and innovative solutions to supporting our researchers across the board and continuing the important work, both related to COVID-19, but the broader research portfolio at our universities as well.
That's really interesting. And if you don't mind, I'd like to kind of stay on that collaboration point for a moment, because I find it fascinating. We've heard from the healthcare side of things how hospitals have come together and collaborated through the course of this. Obviously, you all have, because I've heard a couple of you say that. What did it look like before this? I mean, was there any kind of collaboration taking place? And then moving forward, do you see this being something that you'll continue as we move down the line?
Well,
anyone can start.
I think that Indiana is remarkable in the level of collaboration between Notre Dame and Purdue. The Indiana CTSI has been a decade of collaboration between these institutions. We have regular meetings, we have joint grants together, and I think that really positioned us well when we were in the early stages of this pandemic. Both how do we keep campuses safe, how do we get testing set up, but also how do we quickly mobilize so we can redirect our research, like that registry that you heard about, or biospecimen banking of patients, or we have a program called All In, which is we prospectively identify people who are interested in being involved in clinical trials, so we can very quickly identify subjects for clinical trials and all. So I think it's even deeper than it was, but we started at a really good place.
Yeah.
I'm relatively new to Notre Dame and to Indiana, but I will say, as a newcomer, I have been so pleased with that. And my sense is, both within Indiana and more broadly across the Midwest or across the United States, I think there's collaboration that was going on, and there were good relationships set up, and then it just really intensified with the pandemic, because instead of this important set of things that you want to do together over the next 3 to 5 years, you have that important set of things that you want to do together, or maybe this next year or the next 3 years, et cetera. You also have, 30 things that you need to get done this month, and instead of everybody figuring them out on their own, I think there's been, because there were those pre-existing relationships, there was greater willingness and to sort of lean in and talk to each other, and so that whole communication and learning from us really stepped up. And I'll give a compliment to BioCrossroads on this. They ran a whole series of conversations where we could all regularly learn from each other and help create the sort of venues for that collaboration.
Dr. Mayer?
Yeah, I'd just like to echo a great appreciation and thanks to BioCrossroads, because the regular communications that we had really just supplemented the ongoing activities of bringing the universities together to really try to learn from one another and, again, to continue to operate. But I'll just, again, echo that our pre-existing relationships, the very large NIH programs that we have jointly together as 3 institutions, we were able to leverage those and pivot very rapidly in order to respond to some of the challenges that were presented and some of the big questions that we were trying to answer and continue to try to answer throughout the COVID pandemic. I just also like to point out that it's not simply the research universities working together. We have a deep network of partners. We work with small companies, large companies, and one of the things that's been really interesting throughout the pandemic, and particularly in the early days, is the number of small companies that reached out, because I think there was very quick recognition that our campuses, in effect, are living laboratories. And so we are a place that companies can work, we can engage, and we can both provide an avenue to test new technologies, to test new products, in addition to translating the work that we're doing out into the community. So it's not simply small companies. We also have deep relationships with many large companies that are working in this area, and again, the pre-existing relationships allow them to reach into the universities and tap the resources that we have in order to really move our work forward collectively.
I should have mentioned this at the very beginning, by the way, that you all collectively represent the fan base at the Kirschner House, by the way, IU, Purdue, and Notre Dame. So I just wanted to get that, make that very clear. So you all had work going on before COVID started. What happened to that work? Were you able to continue it? How was it impacted once this all hit? Or was the focus completely on COVID-19 then?
Well, for Indiana University, we, of course, had relatively little virology research going into COVID. But one of the interesting things was that from mid-March till about June, a fair amount of our research was, the wet bench research was hibernated, but we had our faculty working at home, analyzing data, writing papers, and submitting nearly $100 million worth of grants. And so I would say maybe we need to do that more, because we got quite a bit of funding, and we finished up the year with a record of $850 million of funding, over $500 million for the School of Medicine. And we, through the same kind of thing that Notre Dame and Purdue has done, is implement a really robust, public health measures and testing and tracing and everything. We're back to full force in the labs now. But I do think it was interesting to have that time for people to think very carefully about either how do I pivot some of my work to COVID, or just doubling down on the work you're doing, but being able to have some time to actually think and write.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll just, again, pick up on where Jay left off and say that if you look at Purdue's portfolio, as a major STEM institution in the country, we were able to pivot the approximately 20% of our portfolio that's really focused on health-based research. Many of the investigators were able to pivot the work that they were doing. Sometimes in one of our laboratories, they had been developing therapeutic targets for the SARS and MERS outbreak, and we were able to leverage that many years of effort in order to seek funding, a very rapid funding mechanism from NIH to be able to continue that work and expand that to look at the COVID situation. But in other areas, again, just across the engineering domain, we had researchers who were able to use their skills in looking at particle transmission in the air to understand safety in environments like we're in today, in airplanes, and really contribute to the public understanding of transmission. So there were many number of different areas, but I do want to underscore that, of course, we have a large base of research outside of the COVID-related areas and health-related areas. And it was very important for us to also maintain that research, bring it back online, and to continue to advance those portfolios as well. And we've been able to do that. We do have some data because it's been very important, particularly to the federal government, to understand what the impact has been so that as we look at deliverables on programs, that there's an understanding of how we can make up for the time that was spent with the labs in a ramp down situation. So we partnered with Microsoft to develop an application that allowed us to track that very carefully, to look at the effort that was realigned, the effort that was lost towards those goals and deliverables. And over the period where we did have ramped down activities, we had about $140 million in expenditures, and we estimated about a $15 million loss in effort and funding towards those goals and deliverables. And so again, we're working together on the national stage in order to help our public leaders understand the impact that it's had, and then in the hopes of working with our agencies. I would like to emphasize that both our industry partners as well as the federal agencies have been tremendously helppful to work with in terms of giving us the flexibility to extend deadlines, and in many cases even giving and providing supplemental funds to help us pick up.
Dr. Miranda, anything to add on that?
Yeah, as we all began dealing with COVID, one of the things that I started saying, and I say it pretty often now, is that I don't want our university to just survive COVID. I want us to come out the other end of COVID bigger, stronger, better, faster. So what does that mean? So part of it is there's a pivot of our research portfolio to address COVID-19, but there's a broader set of questions around COVID-19, around public health, around virology, around aerosols, those sorts of things, but also around social inequities, et cetera, that COVID has really laid bare. So we wanted to pivot and increase the strength of that, at the same time to move our research portfolio that was not focused on COVID, move that forward as well. We also want to make sure that we think really hard about these various adaptations that we've made, and not, whenever COVID's in our rearview mirror, not just sort of like leave them all behind us, figure out which of these might we deliberately adopt going forward. So for example, there's a conference that we host on a regular basis that which we host on campus, and it usually, the number of people who attended when we pivoted to a virtual conference, the number of people who attended tripled, because they didn't, there wasn't the travel expenses and all that sort of stuff. And so beginning to think through which of the adaptations that we've made to deal with COVID could actually help make our research productivity get higher, stay higher, or, get further enhanced. So thinking all the time of all the things that we're doing and all the things that we should do, which one of these things are going to make us bigger, stronger, better, faster? And let's push really hard on those and make sure that we don't just survive COVID, but we become better because we went through COVID. And I think a great example of that is the enhanced level of, while there were lots of relationships before, the enhanced level of collaboration amongst these three universities, the enhanced level of collaboration with companies, and the enhanced level of engagement between our universities and local health-related organizations, whether it's local clinics or local health departments or the state health department or community groups interested in health, et cetera. All of those things are ways, all of those things are things we want to keep in place to make us better for having gone through COVID together.
It's interesting that you mentioned the whole virtual aspect. We heard that earlier today too, about maybe being able to bring more people to the table, or leveling the playing field, if you will. And I did want to ask, touching on that a little bit, what does research look like, I guess, when you are forced to work from home, as so many of us have, or when you're not able to go out into the field or into the lab or wherever that research is conducted? And you mentioned, Dr. Hess, about some of the other work you've been able to get done in terms of funding. So what did it look like? And is it something that you would put in a plus column, or is it something that you're like, we need to get back to where we were?
Well, I must admit, I'm wondering if it's really necessary to have every single one of our faculty members or postdocs or whatever actually physically in Indianapolis, because personally, I'm probably more productive working from home than having all these relatively inefficient meetings and traveling around. But quite seriously, I know in the IT world that postdocs often don't live in the city that they do their postdoc in, and also I think we need to rethink as we build expensive buildings and work to physically recruit people. Do we have some research teams that just have really good connectivity, and what do we need? When do we really need to get together, and when can we rely on technology?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah, we learned a lot about our research enterprise, and as we really tried to answer just some very basic questions in terms of understanding what research was able to continue and what research was impacted in terms of the level of effort. We found that over 50% of our investigators, our researchers, were able to really continue pretty much uninterrupted through the work that they're doing to support modeling and simulation, data analysis and the like. And that was a really, I think, I wouldn't have expected that number to be quite as large, but I do think it does mean that we have the ability, I think, to interact more freely. That's certainly something that this generation, I think, as we look at our children coming up through high school, having experienced this, it's going to change the way that they think about the future and they interact. So there are silver linings, and we certainly, the feedback that I'm getting for the researchers who are back in the labs, that they're able to work more efficiently to conduct the experiments, and we've been able to maintain just a de-densified operation, and that may continue on into the future. It's certainly a consideration as we think about the future of higher education. We are considering what are those long-standing positives, net positives, that are going to come out of just the learning that we've done through this time.
Yeah. Dr. Miranda?
So I agree with my colleagues that there's been this kind of opening up and thinking about the flexibility of the workplace and people's work schedules, and I think that well, certainly for computational scientists, your ability to keep work going, assuming that you have the right IT infrastructure in place at your university, that you can continue things. I agree about this flexibility. I agree about, we've always been collaborating with people at other universities, so the notion that you could have multi-locations for people in your own laboratory, depending upon the work that the lab is doing. I don't want to come across negative, and I don't want to, return to an issue, but I think we do need to remember that with COVID-19, it's had a disproportionate impact on our female scientists. That's very clearly documented in the number of papers submitted by men versus women. There's a study done by a study done on submissions to Science and Nature, comparing it to a year ago and 2 years ago. So I do think we have to pay attention to this group of researchers who it's great if they can work from home and it can be more flexible, but within the context of the pandemic, when they might also have children that they're caring for at home, et cetera, whether they're men or women, but the reality of our society right now is it is more typically women, that we need to be cognizant that going forward, we have to figure out how to shore up that group provide the kinds of support that group of scientists needs if we're going to keep them, fully enthusiastic about discovery science.
And that's an interesting notion too, and I'm sure something that will require a little bit more study as we move forward. And maybe it does lead into this next question that I have, and I was just wondering, do you think this will increase, rejuvenate, or diminish interest in the research field or in biosciences, having gone through all of this pandemic?
I'd say it will increase it.
Yeah. Why do you say that?
Well, there are, again, national discussions, and this is not specific to higher education or to research universities. I think the issue that Miranda brings up are applicable to the broader community. We're seeing many articles that there has been a disproportionate impact on women in very many career streams, and so that is something that we certainly need to consider. But as we're looking at higher education in particular, because of the very significant financial losses that universities are facing right now, we did a poll of the Big Ten that IU and Purdue are part of, and we learned that there will be a very significant hiring freeze in place for new and incoming faculty. So just to put that in perspective, for Purdue alone, last year we hired over 100 new faculty. So if we look at that across the U.S., I think there are significant concerns that we could potentially lose a generation of scientists who either take different career streams or just drop out and I would say different career streams altogether. That's also impacting the inbound. So again, we're working together with our federal agencies because the federal government is very concerned about this. The work that we're doing, the talent that we're training is a critical part of our economic competitiveness in the country. It's a critical part of our national security. And so our federal agencies are looking at ways that there can be additional funds invested to provide a bridge for those who are basically facing a limited number of positions that are available in an already highly competitive field. And so I hope that that is something that we will see success in the federal agencies coming forward, because at the end of the day, our number one product is talent, and our country relies on the talent that we're producing at our leading research institutions.
Dr. Hess?
Personally, I think this will be the decade of health. I mean, we've seen a tremendous increase in the number of people applying for the MPH program in the School of Public Health. I think we've also seen some people that think twice about a career in medicine if it means, that you're going to be battling COVID for several years, perhaps, in the future. But I think overall, this is like the space program in the 1960s. I mean, this is the magnitude of the challenge that we have to face, and I think most people that I work with are energized by what we need to do.
So I completely agree with this point about the people who are finishing up right now and what the job market looks like and how they might, and what we know is that during these times of, we have a couple of different crises going on. So there's economic dislocation related to the pandemic, but in addition to the pandemic, right? So we know that when people finish up either at the undergraduate level or the graduate level, or they finish their postdocs, if they're finishing up at a time when there's economic dislocation, we know that they take fundamentally different paths, and we lose people from science. So I agree with that point that there's a fragility in that population, and completely support this notion of both federal and state investment in keeping those people fully engaged and figuring out better transitions to keep them in science. At the same time, I think this point that Dr. Hess made about this is going to be the decade of health, I think that COVID-19, there's a whole series of science-related questions that have been covered sometimes in excruciating detail, but nevertheless covered really widely. And people, the number of people who were talking about, like, who did you know who wasn't a scientist who talked about aerosol transmission a year ago, right? So I think there's just been so much more conversation about scientific concepts that I'm hoping what this means for young people, that they will be sort of migrating into, more aggressively into sciences and engineering. And we certainly see at our university an increased level of interest in science and engineering fields. at the undergraduate level, certainly, and I'm hoping that gets backed up into K-12, and we're using this moment in time as an opportunity to help people to understand how interesting science is, how important science is, and how they can become a scientist and help shape outcomes across the world.
And I think that's a great note to end on right there. And thank you all so much for your time, for your talent, for your expertise. Really appreciate all the work that you've done, not only just the past few months, but just in general. So thank you for being here, for your time. Well, for the next part of our summit, we're going to hand it back over to Patty now. Patty?